Okay, then we're recording, and I hope you're all well, that you haven't been blown away by tornadoes or caught in a snowstorm or any of the other various things that we seem to have encountered with this virus situation. But again, if we look at that pattern, starting with the 10th of Tevet, then about the conclusion of Pesach, the severity of it should start decreasing. At least that's the pattern. And maybe we'll have time to look at a few more things if we get to the end of the lesson in Ezekiel 24, because I think there's some more hints in there as to how this actually comes. It's not going to be like a scorching fire. We can actually see a pattern where Ezekiel is being told to put water into the cauldron first, which the effect of it is that the water means that things take a long time to heat up. And so the judgments would actually be prolonged over a series of events in time if we're just going by his prophecy of the 10th of Tevet. But I don't know. I don't know if we want to get that far off into prophecy, if we just want to stick with the Torah portion. So let me start screen sharing with you. And play from start. Here we go. And like I said, I just put this together today, and so I have not checked my references. And if you'll notice on the introductory slide, I did not put a reading from the New Testament because I think there's so many. And so what I did is I actually put them on the second slide. So as you're going back through it, whenever you rewatch the video or whatever, they didn't line up exactly the way I wanted them to because I put the picture of the fire in there. But they should be point for point instead of offset like they are just a little bit. So we're going back to the idea of why it's important to have a Torah portion index, whether you put it on index cards, whether you buy yourself a little journal or a diary, a little notebook, whatever you like to write in. And as you go through each Torah portion, you want to make some bullet points. And in those bullet points, you want to tell what is the theme or what exactly is covered in that particular Torah portion. For instance, we're doing the Torah portion Shmini today. So let's say I got up this morning when I started studying, and I would just go through it. I would just scan through it. When I first started, I get my notebook or whatever I'm writing in, and I say, okay, this is Shmini, the 8th day. I would go ahead and define what the word or the phrase meant. That's important because if you're going to connect the events, you really need that name tag to hold on to. And that's how you're going to learn your Hebrew vocabulary, at least your scriptural Hebrew vocabulary. So you see Shmini, and you know it means 8th. And so as you scan through there, you say, well, it's about the different offerings for the priests, for the priesthood. It goes through there and talks actually about different kinds of offerings. It might talk about an Olah offering. It might talk about a sin offering. It might talk about a peace offering. And so later on, let's say I do get to the letter to the Hebrews and they start talking about different types of offerings, then I can go back through my index cards. I can come to Shmini, and it might give me context for what the letter to the Hebrews is about. I might also in my bullet points put that this supernatural fire, it says, went forth from Adonai and it consumed the offering, the Olah offering. And remember, Olah, you know this, I've said it a million times, but I'm going to keep saying it just because it's important. It says it consumed the Olah offering. Your English translation usually says whole burnt offering. And I think that's when I keep repeating myself to the point you're ready to scream. But a lot of people don't know that the whole burnt offering is actually the Olah offering, and it represents resurrection. And so as I'm reading resurrection texts, I can always go back to these foundational offerings and look where the Olah offering is being used, look at the contexts in which it's being used, and say, okay, even though it just seems at first glance it's talking about a bunch of dead animals and the pieces that go on the altar, I know it is talking to me that there's some aspect of resurrection that's pictured by this particular offering. And so we have this supernatural fire on the 8th day. It goes out and it consumes the Olah, or the resurrection offering, it says, in the fats. And at that point, the people praised and fell on their faces. Next, we have a tragedy. We have this great ecstasy, this great spiritual ecstasy that's occurring. And it is at this point just like we're watching it because of the way that the story is told. And then all of a sudden we realize that Aaron's 2 sons, Nadav and Abihu, have grabbed up their censers, put coals and incense in there, and they go in, they try to approach the holy place to offer the incense even ahead of their father, and the fire basically consumes them, right? They become an Olah offering themselves. They become a whole burnt offering, but yet without being burned up, which is interesting. And I think we looked at that maybe 2 years ago, or maybe last year when we were doing resurrection in each of the Torah portions. We have, after that, we have rituals of mourning, which is, again, incredibly important in Scripture. It's important in Scripture to know how to mourn. And if we have a chance to work through Ezekiel 24 this week, you'll see how heavy the instructions are to Ezekiel, because he's being given a prophecy of Jerusalem's fall, the siege of Jerusalem and her fall. And as the ultimate message to Ezekiel, he says, I'm going to take the thing that is most precious to you. And he says, I'm going to take your wife, and I'm not going to allow you to observe the mourning rituals for your wife. You're just going to have to walk around and pretend like everything's okay. But this was a message to Jerusalem. You're about to lose the most precious thing to you. You're about to lose your city and your temple, but you're not going to be allowed to mourn. You're going to be taken captive, and you're just going to have to walk around like everything's okay. And but we know that mourning rituals are important, and bad things happen when we don't mourn properly. Then we start acting out in ways that we don't even understand, because we've not allowed our hearts to go through that separation process. Instructions here about not drinking wine when you're conducting holy services. Again, we have more offerings and so forth. We have this conversation between Moses and Aaron about whether it would have actually been proper for him to eat the sin offering in the holy place, since he was mourning over sons, even though he was not allowed to do the mourning rituals, because the emotional state was so strong that it wasn't proper to eat the sin offering, and Moses accepts this. Then we have a troublesome passage, which is the difference between clean and unclean animals, and the necessity to identify these sorts of animals so that we will know what we should and what we shouldn't put in our mouths. And it's actually a long passage in relation to the rest of the information here. Chapter 11 is a long passage of material on the foods that are permitted to be eaten. And then, some little odds and ends thrown in there that they're really going to be important at some point. especially as we look back at the lesson we had on how they came out of Egypt, basically from the beginning through a judgment on the potter, the Egyptian god who was the potter, the builder, who was believed to have formed man out of the mud of the Nile. That god was judged, and he was exposed as really, being something that could be shattered into pieces. And that's another message. We've had the message before, seemed like just a little piece thrown into another Torah portion, where it says that, if an earthen vessel absorbs an impurity, then you have to break it. If it's a metal vessel, then you can pass it through the fire, you can pass it through the water, and it can be clean again. But an earthenware vessel, a pottery vessel, because it absorbs liquid, and you cannot extract back out of that vessel what it absorbed. So in this case, in chapter 11, verse 33 of Leviticus, it says, any earthenware utensil, and to whose interior one of them, and it's talking about an unclean, creepy creature, into whose interior one of them will fall, everything in it shall become impure, and you shall break it. Of any food that is edible, upon which water comes, shall become impure, and any liquid that can be drunk in any vessel shall become impure. Anything upon which part of their carcass may fall shall be impure. Even if it's an oven, if it's a clay oven, it has to be smashed. And again, the reason for that is because it is earthenware. It's clay, dirt, it's absorbent. And once it absorbs this liquid, there's no way to extract the filthiness, if you look at it in the physical sense, but in the spiritual sense, there's no way to extract the tameh back out of it. That can only be done with a metal vessel that's designed to move from generation to generation. I think I said last week, you don't really think of an earthenware vessel, a piece of pottery, especially if you've ever been on an archaeological dig and dug up shards of it. You realize it was never intended to be passed from generation to generation as an inheritance, but a metal vessel could be passed along. Not so much because of its durability, but because it could be cleansed. Whereas an earthenware vessel could not. And those of you who have been up to Shiloh, where the Mishkan, the tabernacle, stood, they're changing it. It's changed so much in the past 20 years. It's a lot harder to walk around there and just do whatever you want to do. But those of you who have been there, especially if you've been there a long time ago, you know that it was possible to just walk around and scoop up pottery, as long as you were in sight of where the tabernacle would have stood. Once you move out of sight of it, then there's no more pottery. That's it. But that's from, hundreds of years of people eating their holy meals in these pottery dishes. And then once they finish the holy meal, then they smash the pottery. Why would they do that? Well, number one, they've just had a holy meal. They have to smash the pottery because remember, there's certain offerings that you do eat, and there's a time limit. You have to eat the thing up. You can't just leave it there and have leftovers after so much time passes. And so in order to prevent that sin of eating something that's gone past its specified time of holiness, because remember, the pottery absorbs the liquids of the offering, the juices, the fats, and so forth that might drip out of it, rather than have somebody else come along, use that pottery, where now you have a residue in that pottery that's now in the classification of unclean. They smash it, and then there's no danger that somebody might actually use that particular plate or whatever to consume a holy meal. because there's no way to get the uncleanness out of it. It has to be smashed. And so, you know, it concludes, see if there's anything important. If you were doing your index cards, those are the things that I would put down as my bullet points. Because from then we go to Tazria next week when she sows seed. But it concludes with, you know, these are the things that are impure and that are pure, between creatures that may be eaten and creatures that may not be eaten. And there's a connection among all these things. And so if I look at the Torah portion, I can say, well, here's 4 main points. I look at my bullet points and I can see, well, it was about the glory descending, the fire coming down, and then the glory or the presence filling the Mishkan, the tabernacle. I know it's about dietary laws. I know it's about holiness, and probably I should have put 8th first, but I concluded with 8th. It's about the 8th day. And we know that the 8th day is going to have a special significance throughout Scripture. And that's what I want to unpack in tonight's class and in tomorrow's class. Why is the 8th day related to the dietary laws? How did these seemingly unrelated topics, dietary laws, holiness, the 8th day, the priesthood, the flaming fire and glory, how do all these items end up in the same Torah portion? How am I supposed to see the relationship among those things? And then I gave you on the right-hand side, and I don't know that we'll have time to do it tomorrow, but if we don't, I would challenge you to do this as homework. I would challenge you to take this slide, isolate this slide when you get the recording, and go back and forth. Look at, once you've read the whole Torah portion, don't try to do it without reading the whole Torah portion. Look at the glory and what you learned about glory last week in terms of Pharaoh and his type of glory versus Adonai and his glory. The liver, the heaviness of it, and what that can represent, either in terms of arrogance or in terms of having a receptive heart, because remember, the heart and the liver were equivalent expressions. And so in unpacking the glory there, I gave you some scriptures to look up, and it's good always to look them up in context, but I just gave you pretty much single ones. So it would be Hebrews 1:3, Luke 2:14, Luke 9:26, John 7:18, and John 8:54. And as you have time this week, and most of us have plenty unless we're working in healthcare or something critical, go back and look at those in context and see what conclusions you can draw about glory. Kavod, remember the word is kavod. And for something to be heavy is kaved. Remember, Eli fell off the stump when he heard that the ark had been captured. It said his heart trembled, but he was heavy. He was kaved. And we know that he was kaved because he had become hardened to sin in his own household. So I want you to kind of do that same thing. Think of what glory is in the good side and on the bad side, and then take those scriptures and say, okay, why did she choose these particular contexts for me to decode how glory in the Torah portion, Shmini, is helping me understand what's over here in the New Testament. Same thing with the dietary laws. We have an extensive section on dietary laws, and that's what I'm hoping to unpack, like I say, by the end of the lesson, at least tomorrow, for us to see more clearly what Peter saw in his vision and how it relates to this Torah portion and the 8th day. I think we've always been able to see the connection between the Torah portion and Peter's vision. I don't know that we've always brought the 8th day and what it symbolizes into the equation. So you might want to save that one until you get both recordings, because I don't know how far I'll get in that part tonight. But that's Acts 10:1 through 11:18. And don't just stop at Cornelius's house. Go on and continue reading into where Peter's explaining what he saw to other people, how he interprets his own vision. And by the way, Dr. Robin Gould, she has some great Becky books that address these dietary laws. And if you have people who are new to the Torah and they don't really get the dietary laws, but they're open to understanding what the scripture, at least in the New Testament, says and what it doesn't say, I'd highly recommend those. You just key in Becky books on Amazon, or you go to your local bookseller and ask them to look up the Becky books. And she has, I can't remember if it's 2 or 3 that address the dietary laws specifically, but very short, very easy reads, but really, I think powerful. Just even though they're brief, that's what we wanted in Becky books. We wanted brevity, but at the same time, we wanted to let the power of the Holy Spirit speak through the words. So it's a great resource. Holiness is obviously a big thing in this Torah portion. So I'm sending you to 2 Corinthians 1:12 and 2 Corinthians 7:1 to see if you can make some holiness connections there. And then finally, 8th, going back to the title of the Torah portion, the heaviness of the 8th day in the tabernacle. So I'm giving you Acts 7:8 and Luke 1:57 through 80. And even though we're not bringing in circumcision in the Torah portion as the 8th day, I did want you to see how it factors, the theme of it is going to factor in, especially once we pair it with the dietary laws. So that's your homework. That's your mission, should you choose to accept it. So let's just read a brief passage here. We won't read a long one, just to get an overview. So this is Leviticus 9:22. It says, of course, we're talking about the 8th day. Then Aaron lifted up his hands toward the people and blessed them. And he stepped down after making the sin offering and the burnt offering and the peace offerings. Moses and Aaron went into the tent of meeting. When they came out and blessed the people, the glory of the Lord, the kavod, the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people. Then the fire came out from before the Lord and consumed the burnt offering and the portions of the fat on the altar. And when all the people saw it, they shouted and fell on their faces. And remember, that is one of the characteristics of kavod or kaved. It's like the liver is kaved because it's the heavy organ. Glory is something that's heavy, and it appears to be impenetrable to human beings unless they enter into a certain protected state. We see that from time to time, that somehow they get this special protection where they can endure it, but the fire of the glory will consume the average human being. And even if you're the high priest, if you do what you do in disobedience, the glory or the fire could kill you, or like in the case of Eli, the high priest, it would be ikavod. Remember his daughter-in-law named her newborn ikavod. We hear it in English as Ichabod, but it's kavod, glory. There is no glory. The glory has departed from here. So you can see 2 reactions. If you want to know, well, how does this glory, this kavod work? Well, it can be very heavy when it falls in a glorious way. And when that happens, typically a human being cannot stand up. We see that in the temple. And you may have even experienced it before. Maybe you were in prayer. Maybe you were in praise and worship. Maybe you were reading scripture. I've had it happen to me before when I had the scroll rolled out and I was reading out of the scroll. It's an overwhelming heaviness and weight, but not in a bad way. You just feel like you're standing in a place that the human body is not designed to be in, and it's not at this point. We had actually a better design till we messed it up with sin. But bringing these offerings of peace and sin and olah, resurrection offerings, we see that the glory of the Lord did appear. The fire did come out. And so we have this supernatural fire, just like Moses saw the burning bush. It was not of natural origin. In the same way, the first fire on the altar is not going to be of natural origin. So if we're going to tie those four themes together, the eighth, the holiness, the glory, and the dietary laws. First, we've got to go back to Kitisa and review something. I gave you a paradigm. I gave you a pattern. And if you still have your Kitisa recording with the PowerPoints, I'd recommend you go back and look at it. But I have imported those. I took the basic ones out of there and just copied into this week's. So they'll look familiar, but just to help you recall, remember it was the 7 makings or the 7 doings of creation that we lined up, we matched up with the building of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, which was also built with 7 makings or 7 doings. Remember, it was the Hebrew verb asa. We looked at those different verb forms as they appeared in the twin 7s of makings, comparing the creation to the building of the Mishkan. And that's what we realized when we got to the end. This was Israel's chance to learn from the creation. I'm going to add that word in this lesson because learning is a key component as to how we need to look at the Mishkan. We are learning to be like our Creator, but we are also learning that we are not the Creator. And that's going to be a critical thing in helping us decode the 6th, 7th, and 8th days and what each one of them is designed to teach us. But let's just review right quick the creation of the Mishkan and how it relates to the creation itself. So Exodus, taking from Exodus 40, verses 2 and 17, putting them together, it says, on the first day of the first month, you shall set up the tabernacle of the tent of meeting. Okay, that's when the Mishkan is set up. That's when it's erected. And when we think of what happened in the beginning, at the creation, there was, the garden itself was a type of Mishkan. It was a type of tabernacle or a temple. I also gave you some scriptures a few weeks back that show you the equivalency of expression between the Mishkan and the Mikdash, the tabernacle and the temple. And so there's this idea that the garden itself was a type of Mishkan or Mikdash. What happened? Adam and Eve fell from that priesthood. They fell out of the garden. That's what sin does. It makes you fall. And we see that portrayed in the serpent. He walks in apparently on 2 legs like a human being, but then he is cursed to fall down and go on his belly. And that describes the at least one category of these foods that we're not supposed to eat. Anything that would fall down and go on its belly. Now, if it hops, that's a different story because it's not crawling and dragging its belly across the ground. But anything that crawls, that creeps on 4 legs, it says these things are an abomination to you. even touching their carcass. Now, if it's alive, it's different. Okay, if it's alive, it's alive. You don't have to be afraid to touch a pig. You don't have to be afraid to touch a worm. You're not going to eat them. As long as they're alive, they're fine. They're doing exactly what they were created to do. They're living creatures. But when this particular creature, remember when it falls into the earthen vessel and dies, that's when you have to destroy it. And so you're going to have this awareness that when I look at the animal kingdom, one important category is I should avoid things that fall down and go on their belly, because that is a reminder of the original sin. That one, I trespassed against a dietary law. I let my belly override my spirit, because remember, the spirit operates based on it is written. The soul, the nefesh, like the serpent, the part of us that we have in common with an animal, that part of us functions based on I feel, I want, I think. And what you feel, want, and think are transitory. They will change from minute to minute. You know how 16-year-olds are. They're in love 1 minute and they hate the next minute. Okay, maybe it's not 16-year-olds, maybe it's 26-year-olds. But at any rate, that's the human condition. That's what happens when you fall down and go on your belly. When you allow the soul, the nefesh, to dictate to the spirit how you're going to conduct your life. When you let the soul dictate what's your appetite, how that's going to be met, what you put in your mouth, right? And even more than what you put in your mouth, remember the type of food that you're eating. What are you looking at? What are you reading? What are you listening to? All these are foods that you're taking into your body. And if you're going garbage in, if you're eating creepy things, then you've got creepy things dying inside of you. And then creepy things are going to come out of you. And then you have to be cleansed. But there is an aspect of you, if you are in Messiah, that can be cleaned. It just may be through hard scouring. It might be through intense heat. Like Ezekiel is talking about, that if you have so accustomed yourself to filth that it's not easily scoured out, then he will put you on the fire and heap up the wood until it's all burned out. But the fleshly part of you, the earthen part of you, is going to have to be destroyed because it's absorbed the essence of these creepy things. So we fell out of this Mishkan, we fell out of the tabernacle, and that's why it was important for the language to be, you shall set up the tabernacle of the tent of meeting. And now we've arrived at the 8th day of the erection of the Mishkan. And so the idea here is when something is fallen, it's because of sin. It's because of judgment. But when something is lifted up, when something is set up, when something rises up, like the Olah offering, or like the sleeper who awakes and arises, these are all pictures again of resurrection, of how you set the tent back up. You know, it talks about the fallen tent of David. Why did it fall? It fell because of the sin of David's descendants. But he's going to set it up again. It's going to arise. There's going to be resurrection. And then it says in verse 17, now in the first month of the second year, on the first day of the month, the tabernacle was erected. So on the first day of the first month of Nisan, and it would have been, we're not far out of, you know, in terms of calendar time, when it was erected. And we know that rabbinic tradition places the beginning of creation on the first of Nisan, the first of the months, corresponding to this erection of this tabernacle, recalling, saying, okay, because the the erection of the tabernacle, the building of the tabernacle, has these 7 twins of makings to the creation, then it makes sense that if he's giving us the actual date when the tabernacle is raised up, then we understand the date when he raises up the creation itself on the first of the months. And we don't really need to get into a debate on Rosh Hashanah, whether it's the head of the year and how it can be simultaneously true. Although, if you're interested in that, you can always go to Truth, Tradition, or Tear and look at how those things interact, because we know whatever happens on the spring side of the feasts is going to happen to a greater extent on the fall side of the feasts. We always look for more severe judgments in the fall. Now, this is probably more severe than we're used to when we think of Passover. When I think of Passover and the severity of what might go on at Passover, I typically, just through past experience, I think of just crazy nuts coming out of the woodwork. That seems to be the pattern in my life. It's just every weird person you can ever imagine is going to cross your path in some way. But this year, it's much more serious than just crazy people, or mean people or evil people or whatever. And so it makes me wonder at this point, what's in store for Rosh Hashanah this year? But we've got our bookends where we're warned that we're going to have a 10-day period of testing. We've got the bookends of Shabbat Hagadol, which is the Pesach preceding, or the Shabbat preceding Pesach. And then we've got the Shabbat Shuvah, which is going to fall between the Feast of Trumpets, Rosh Hashanah, and Yom HaKippurim, the Day of Atonements, the Day of Coverings. And so those are very important markers in terms of the 2 feast seasons. But what we see, especially as we get deeper into some of the rabbinic literature, yes, at Passover, the Father deals with Israel in a very specific way. And he'll deal with them in those specific ways, really regardless of what's going on in the world, whether Israel is at peace, whether Israel is at war, or whether Israel is under siege. They still have the same basic instructions of Passover. So you go through the Passover Haggadah pretty much in the same way in a tribulation year as you would in a good year. But when you look at the fall feast, it's much heavier in terms of judgment. In the Mishnah, it talks about how at Rosh Hashanah, which is the Feast of Trumpets, it's the first of Tishrei, it's the first of the 7th month. It says all the nations pass under the shepherd's staff. In other words, it's not just Israel that's being judged, like at Passover, but at the first of Tishrei, that bookend in the fall, then all the nations are being judged. Decrees are being set for every single nation. Everybody is being reckoned and accounted in the fall feasts. And so with the first of Tishrei, we start the counting that's going to culminate in the Feast of Sukkot, the Feast of the Nations. And it's even called the Feast of the Nations. So Sukkot is typically a very joyous, happy time, but that's if you're in the sukkah. If for some reason you have been ejected from the cloud of glory, or if, by some stretch of the imagination, you found that you were never in the cloud to begin with, that you were among the Gentile nations who were wicked and evil and, completely used for evil, and that you had fallen under judgment, then it's not such a joyous time for you. That's a heavy judgment. But they say that the intention of the creation came on the first of Tishrei, but the actual building of the creation began on the first of Nisan. So Like I said, these should look familiar. They're just in different colors now. But we have many Jewish commentators that point out this parallel because it's so obvious. It may not be obvious to us until somebody points it out to us. That's when people say things are obvious, it's kind of annoying because it wasn't obvious to me till you pointed it out, and then I feel stupid. But on this particular one, it's pretty common that the scholars are going to notice the 7 makings in terms of the pairing. And what you're looking for there in the Hebrew text, which I did not highlight the Hebrew text, so if you can't read the Hebrew, you kind of have to look for the bold, which is not that bold. But you can see that we have different, different verb forms of the Hebrew verb asa, which means to make. So we look at Genesis 1:7. We go back to the creation. It says God made the expanse. There's v'ya'as. V'ya'as is and made. So there's the root word we're looking for. And he separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse. And it was so. Okay, while we're at it, we're going to add something to look for here. Again, I want you to look for a Hebrew word, and I don't have it in bold. But if you can read it, you can see right there, v'yavdel, v'yavdel, and that is, and separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse. So there's 2 things we're looking for here, which is going to help us bring in this Torah portion to Kitisa. He made. We've got asa, and he separated. Okay, and that's going to come from the infinitive verb lehavdil. Lehavdil. If you've ever done havdalah, then that's where that comes from. It's a separation between the end of the Sabbath and the beginning of the secular week. That's how you mark it out. You light a candle, you make kiddush over some wine or whatever. It doesn't have to be wine, but it's supposed to be something I learned this week that arouses you. Okay, and not in that kind of way, but like arouses your senses in a good way, something that's pleasant to you. And then with spices, pleasant spices. And you know, typically we think of the cinnamon and cloves and spices in the jar, but you know, if it's summertime and you've got beautiful lavender and sage in your garden, go pick that. I mean, don't pick it on Shabbat, but you can pick it ahead of time. And, you know, lay that out, you know, as some of your beautiful spices. If you do the Havdalah ceremony, if you don't worry about it. I managed to cut a piece of an almond that still had those pink blooms last week. And it's got a nice little fragrance to it. So it's a very natural, nice spice that's supposed to help you remember, you know, the pleasant smell of Shabbat. So there is one making in the creation. And then we slide down to the Mishkan. In Exodus 25:8, it says, let them construct a sanctuary for me that I may dwell among them. What? It's a commandment so we can get back to the garden. Even though we're fallen from the garden, he's going to give us the same pattern. The same way that he would walk with Adam and Eve in the cool of the evening, that his presence could dwell among them. He says, I want to recover some of that. I want to prepare you for this restoration to the garden. So I want you to do something. And the commandment there in bold is ve'asu. Let them construct, let them create, let them make. He says, a mikdash, a sanctuary for me, so that I can dwell among them. And you can see there, veshekanti, that's where you get the Shekhinah. If you've ever heard people say, well, the Shekinah or the presence, that's the Hebrew root of it is shachan, which means to dwell. He says, I want to dwell among them. I want a restoration of the garden. So let them do what I did. But remember, we are not him. And here's another set of twins, twin makings. It says in Genesis 1:16, God made the two great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. He made the stars also. Okay, that's vaya'as, the same verb we're looking for. And then its counterpart is in Exodus 25:10. It says, they shall construct ve'asu, an ark of acacia wood, 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide, 1.5 cubits high. Right? And so how are they similar? The ark of acacia wood held the tablets of the testimony. And the tablets of the testimony governed the lives of the Israelites. Plus, it was the centerpiece of the Ohel Moed. That was another name for the tabernacle, the Ohel Moed, which means a tent of meeting. And the first mention is going to be on this creation of the fourth day that's mentioned in Genesis 1:16, because he says he made them for the sake of the Moedim, typically translated seasons, but the Moedim are also the 7 feasts of Israel. So what is this Ohel Moed for? It's the tent of meeting where Israel gets together for the feasts. And you have this proto-prophecy of it in Genesis 1. So he says, I made 2 great lights, one to govern the day, the lesser light to govern the night, and made the stars for the sake of the Moedim. What do I want you to do? I want you to make this Mishkan, and within this Mishkan, I want you to construct an ark for my commandments that are going to govern your life. And you're going to put this ark in the tent of meeting. Why? For the sake of the Moedim, so that my people have a place I can dwell among my people at my appointed times. Right? And even, remember I said when we looked at this last set of pairs, pay attention there to the form of lehavdil, which is vayavdel, okay? If we move over here and we were to keep reading the instructions about the ark, it would talk about these separating poles, right? And the root of what those 2 separating poles did is parallel to this separation, the havdil of day and night that occurs on day 4. So we have similar functions. Next, the next pair of makings. First in Genesis 1:25, it says, God made the beasts of the earth after their kind, one of which is being obnoxious right now and grumpy, and the cattle after their kind, and everything that creeps on the ground after its kind. And God saw that it was good. Right? So the idea here again is vaya'as, he made, but then he made distinctions. Time after time on day 6, it'll talk about after their kind, after their kind, after its kind. And then on the same day, there is separation, because then he's going to make the human being. So even though they're created on the same day, they are after their kind, but the human being is after the kind of Elohim. He says, we'll make him in our image, after our likeness. So the likeness of the man is distinct from, it's separated from the beast. And that's why it's so important to know these proto-prophecies, so that when you get to the book of Revelation and you start reading about a man and a beast and the number 666, and then you realize that they're both created on the 6th day, and that there's a message embedded, there's a proto-prophecy embedded in day 6 of creation, then it just simplifies the whole question. especially when you know the dynamic of the 6th, the 7th, and the 8th day. And then the corresponding making in the tabernacle, it's Exodus 25:23. It says, you shall make a table of acacia wood, 2 cubits long, 1 cubit wide, 1.5 cubits high. Okay, another making. But notice in this pair, something important. It's paired the separation of the beast from the man on the 6th day, even though I didn't put the whole day passage in there. You know how it goes because you've done workbook 1. This distinction between what is a beast and what is a man on the 6th day, you can see this echoed in the Mishkan, because this table of acacia wood, there's no provision made at that table to eat a beast. There's no place there to eat flesh. Once you move from the outer court where the brazen altar is, where you do find the flesh of beasts, where you can offer animals on the altar, parts of which can be eaten with certain offerings. And that holds true for the priests as well. They will eat like the sin offerings and so forth. The idea, though, is that's where it stops. That's where we quit eating animals. And once we move past that brazen altar, we go into the holy place, and the table that's prepared there is strictly for a plant-based product. It's for bread. We call it the showbread or the bread of faces. So even the clean animals, they did not go that far. They stopped at the brazen altar. And so once you get into this holy place, if you think of the multitude of offerings that were offered there, the 4 basic ones, plus the mincha that it talks about, you look at the sin offering, the guilt offering, the olah offering, the shlomim offering, the todah offering, and then again the mincha gets scattered in there. You think of all the wonderful things that those offerings represent in terms of heart change in the one that brings the animal. Nevertheless, all those wonderful things, they are really only preparing the way for a much holier place, a place much closer to where you can hear the voice of Adonai speaking from between the 2 cherubim. So you would need to be, in order to go into that special place, in order to go to that table that is going to represent the 12 tribes, you need to be forgiven. You need to be peaceful. You need to be thankful. You need to be whole. You need to be assured of resurrection. You need all those things to be able to function in the holy place, which is where Nadav and Abihu tried to penetrate into. They took the coals from the outer altar, put the incense on it. But see, if you are not all those things, how in the world are you going to penetrate into the holy place without it? And so where they were presumptuous and violated and did not allow their father to go in, it was his job. It was under his authority at that time. It became a strange fire. And that's going to be one of the lessons of this Torah portion, is we should always be careful not to confuse our will, not to confuse our enthusiasm for God's will, because they're not always one and the same. We might be enthusiastic for God, but what we are experiencing may not be his enthusiasm. Sometimes we can get caught up in the romance of the Torah. We can be romanced by the word, and because, again, emotion and desire factor into who we are as human beings, we might begin to mistake feelings and emotions and this romance that we're having with the word for his will. And that's when we have to be careful. Every thought that runs through our brain is not what God said to us that day. Sometimes, I'm sorry to say, it's just what you thought. But you're going to have to prove out if it's actually his word and him speaking to you. Then we go in again to the beast connection of the sixth day. Genesis 1:31 says, God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. Okay, there's the making, asa in Hebrew. And then if we drop down and look at the corresponding making of the Mishkan, Exodus 39:43, it says, Moses examined all the work, and behold, they had done it, just as the Lord had commanded. This they had done. So Moses blessed them. And that's what we know. If we read in Exodus 20:11, we get a little bit more commentary about these 6 days. It says, for in 6 days the Lord made, asa, the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So we see this in the completion of the Mishkan. It says Moses looked at everything they had done. It was just as he had commanded through the Lord. So he blessed them. And we see this pattern in the creation. When you're obedient, that's when he can bless your making, because you were imitating him. You've not confused yourself with him. You were simply imitating him. And then we have in Genesis 2:1, thus the heavens and the earth were completed and all their hosts. And there's a repetition there. Exodus 39:32, thus all the work of the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, was completed. And the sons of Israel did according to all that the Lord had commanded Moses. So they did. So there's the element here of completion, right? When you do according to all that the Lord commanded Moses, there is a sense of completion. Why? Because the whole idea is, as you erect this Mishkan, to give you that sense of what it would be to be in the garden, to be restored to that creation that he made for human beings so that he could dwell with them. So we've got 2 completions here. And we get the idea that it was considered complete because the sons of Israel did according to all that the Lord had commanded Moses. In other words, they were obedient. In the same way, Adam and Eve were put in the garden to work, avodah. And work, or avodah, you can also translate that as worship. And if you do your work in obedience, it is an act of worship. But on Shabbat especially, your worship is your work. It's when you cease your doing, when you cease your making, when you cease your creating. That is a blessed, sanctified day. So that these were basically 2 duties of man in the garden: to work and worship. In other words, obey. And then to guard the holiness of that space. Because remember, it's a special place. It's been planted in a special way. And they were to guard those boundaries. So it says in Exodus 2:3, then God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it. That's where we're going to get this first mention of something as being holy. Because in it, and last one, I put the Hebrew text on there, you can say it actually says, because in him, there's a proto-prophecy for us of Yeshua, because in him, he had rested from all his work, which God had created and made. There's a making. This making is blessed. It's a sanctified making. And then as we look at the Mishkan, Exodus 39:43, first of all, it says Moses blessed them. when they finished it. And then in Exodus 49, it says, then you shall take the anointing oil and anoint the tabernacle and all that is in him or in it, and shall consecrate him, shall consecrate it and all its furnishings, and it shall be holy. Right? So we've got another pair here. We've got a blessing of holiness in the creation, and then we've got a blessing of holiness on the Mishkan. And that's what happens when we rest according to the commandment. Yes, we are resting in the work that Elohim created for us, but we also, and this is the point of allowing us to build the Mishkan. Remember the example of the father who gives the child the coin? And then because the child owns nothing, he allows the child to give the coin back to him. Well, the Mishkan is kind of the same thing. What creation could we give back to the Father when we own nothing? Even the products they brought for the building of the Mishkan weren't theirs. He made everything, but he allowed them to give back to him what was his. So when we give back to him our rest on Shabbat, on that seventh day, according to the commandment, according to the pattern of creation, all we're really doing is just giving back to him what is already his. But we are acknowledging him as the Father. We're acknowledging him as the source, as the creator. And as best we can, being made in his image, we give him a resting place in us. And that's just it. If you have an obedient child, then you don't worry about that child too much. You can rest in that child's measure of responsibility. If you have a child that's always out there breaking the rules, you as the parent have a hard time finding a resting place in that child. Well, on a much grander scale, that's kind of how it is with the Father and us. If we are responsible children and we're making the proper makings, and we're resting our proper restings, if we're resting in obedience, if we're sanctifying his work by imitating his work, then we're actually providing him a resting place. It's not just our being able to rest in the work he's done. Now he's able to rest in us, which is going to lead us to the 8th day. So we're going to look at 5 themes. We've looked at the creation of the universe as a pattern, and I needed to rebuild that for you. I needed for that to be fresh in your mind. And the pairing, those 7 makings with the building of the sanctuary, with the building of the Mishkan. And so we've reestablished that. As we move on, we want to pull in the dietary laws and say, well, what do these things have to do with the creation of the universe and the building of the sanctuary? Well, remember when he places things in specific neighborhoods in Scripture, it's because there is a relationship. So we're going to look at that relationship. We're going to look at the Havdalah ceremony at the end of Shabbat and go back to all our examples of separation. In order for there to be holiness, there must be separation. There must be lehavdil in Hebrew. Lehavdil, that's where you get Havdalah. Creation was a series of separations. And without those boundaries, without those separations, then you really don't have a Shabbat. If you do anything you want to on the 6 days of creation, you don't have Shabbat. Everything came in a specific order, in a specific making, with a specific boundary. And I quoted something last week where it is about obedience in the Shabbat, but it might have been in the special psalm, where it says he was the one who told the ocean, you can only go this far. Even the ocean had a boundary that had to be set. And so we want to look at these boundaries in the Torah portion and see how it relates to Shabbat and these very important boundaries of creation, because remember, they're life-giving. Without the boundaries, we don't have life. He had to set each boundary in place on a specific day in order to prepare the platform for the next day. So it had an order to it. In fact, this passage in Ezekiel we're talking about, the prophecy of the 10th of Tevet, there's a specific order to the way that Ezekiel was supposed to build the fire. Each thing basically setting the stage for the next in terms of the judgments he was prophesying. And then we're going to incorporate the beginning of the Torah portion, Shmini, the 8th, and see how it really encapsulates the message of all these things. So I guess we can stop here and get into that stuff tomorrow. But just as a reminder, because we haven't talked too much about the altar, and if you're going through Leviticus this year and you haven't really nailed down the altar sacrifices and what each of them did, it might be a good idea to go back through your old material from last year and year before last. Or if you have the workbook, and I think it's in Workbook 5, Volume 3, and it would be Lesson 1. It would be Vycroft, if I'm not mistaken. It's going to break down for you in a very simple form the different altar sacrifices so that you can understand that prophetic nature of them. The thing we're interested in right now is because we're all at home because of something called COVID-19. And last week we looked at the relationship between kavod, kavad, heaviness, the liver, and how actually in the month of Tevet, it's associated with the liver, believe it or not. And there's specific prophecies concerning the 10th of Tevet when we know that this particular virus was isolated. It was isolated on the 10th of Tevet. And then ironically, they call it COVID. But it's also interesting how many articles are out there about, where did this thing come from? And it came from where a lot of these viruses come from. It came from wild animals. Or sometimes we've seen things come from animals that maybe weren't wild, like the mad cow disease, but there was something inhumane and inappropriate in the way that those animals were being fed or treated. And when you mistreat the animal that you intend to eat or eat from, then I think the logical expectation has to be that eventually that principle of measure for measure is going to break back out on you. And so up until this point, we know in the garden all they had was plants. They had a plant-based diet. After the flood, he says, okay, you can have animals. He doesn't, we can argue over whether he only gave them clean animals. We know that no one knew the difference between a clean animal and an unclean animal. Whether he was eating that way or not, who knows? We know the rest of the nations certainly didn't take that to heart as they spread around the earth. But even in the Noahide laws, the basic moral instructions to mankind, there has to be a humane treatment of the animals that you're going to eat. You cannot drink their blood. You cannot eat their blood. There's no blood sausages. Even if you're from Louisiana, there's no boudin. You cannot have that. It's inappropriate to eat the blood of any animal, wild or domestic. And in this Torah portion, Israel is set apart in a very specific way, in a way that has not been mentioned in Scripture up until this point. They are given specific animals that we already know have been in a class of either clean or unclean, and now he's relating it very specifically to our diet. If we call ourselves Israel, if we call ourselves one of these 12 tribes, then we have to deal with the animal kingdom in this particular way. And in our generation, we've had all sorts of hints, because the closer we get to the animal kingdom, the easier it is for them to transmit things to us. We've had these bird flus, we've had the swine flu, we get infected with things from chickens and so forth. So again, the way you treat the animal, the more you pull it away from its intended use, it seems the more susceptible you are to being infected by that particular animal. And just as a reminder, when you look at the prophecy of Moses and the Song of Moses, we are warned of the 4 altar judgments. And then you see these 4 altar judgments through the prophets. You also see the 4 altar judgments mentioned by Yeshua in the Gospels. You see them, John mentioned them in his revelation. So the 4 altar judgments do not change. And if you say, well, there was 10 plagues, you have to say yes, but all 10 plagues, they are rooted in these 4 altar judgments. And if you look at the 4 altar judgments and then pair what you know about this particular Torah portion, these 4 altar judgments are going to come out of the fire of the heavenly altar. And when we get to the book of Revelation, you can hear the altar talking. That's pretty amazing. The altar speaks. But there are 4 altar judgments that will come from above and that will affect the earth below. And that's going to be famine, which literally means hunger, ra'ev in Hebrew, the plague or the pestilence, the sword, which can mean war or taking peace, but it can also mean to make thirsty. The literal meaning of sword, cherev, means to make thirsty. And then the 4th one that we don't hear much about, but it's actually very much with us, and that is the wild beasts. That's the 4th altar judgment. And we have very specific examples of what can be considered a wild beast. But in terms of a wild beast plague, you can see how there's actually some overlap with the specific plague, with the specific pestilence. The beast can actually be the messenger or the carrier of the plague. Just like famine can bring on the sword, or the sword can bring on the famine. The sword can bring on the plague. The sword can bring on the wild beast. The wild beast can bring on the famine. I know some of you have been looking at the news articles and you realize there's a huge locust attack going on in the Middle East and Africa. And so you say these are not separate things so much as they are to be seen as things working together for these judgments to go out from the fire of the altar. And in fact, there is fire being thrown down from the altar. If we go to the book of Revelation, John speaks of that. And that's what he's seeing. But we also have other ways. And that's why I say, in terms of judgment, sometimes we look for very specific things and then we kind of miss what's right in front of us. A wild beast, we think literally of a wild beast, like say swine flu or COVID. You know, maybe we got that from bats or something. Bird flu, mosquitoes, malaria. Yeah, we get those things from wild bees, but there's also a human counterpart to these things. For instance, if we look at Acts 19, 26 through 27, where Paul is attacked by the manufacturers of the silver idols of Diana at Ephesus, he later refers to them in 1 Corinthians 15:32 as wild beasts. He said, I fought with wild beasts at Ephesus. What is he saying? A wild beast as a judgment can be more than a literal wild beast. It can be human beings who are behaving as wild beasts. And in that specific context, he sees them as idolaters who are ensnared in the idolatrous economic systems. That's why I say, don't look at these four altered judgments as something independent of one another. They work together. That's why you see in Revelation, as these four horses ride out, you hear the four living creatures, the chayot. You hear them say, bo, 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 come, 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 come. And even though they appear to be staggered, if you pair them to the corresponding feast, they're very close together. They're right up on top of one another. Because it takes us a few minutes to read through it, we think that there's, this much time between them. But again, look back at the feast. If you look back at Passover, unleavened bread, and first fruits of the barley, it's all occurring within 1 week. So we have to see, again, these things working in concert, not independently of one another. Because if we think of idolaters, and they're ensnared in this idolatrous economic system, then you can see how the hunger, which famine is hunger, ra'ev, when you're worried about your belly and then you see this apostle come and start preaching something that makes people quit buying your product, you start feeling that in your gut. Now you're starting to feel a little hungry because this is threatening my economic security. And then you begin to behave like a wild beast, and you may use the sword in order to enforce. And so it's just it's like everything else. Sometimes we just have to say yes. It's not an either or. It's each one teaching you an aspect, but all four working together to accomplish the same purpose. And so even if you look at Daniel's prophecy and John's kingdoms in Revelation, you can see that they're represented by beasts. What do we know about those beasts? They control economic systems. They can wield the sword in terms of making war. And there's even a mark, a nega, of the beast, right? That we might put under the heading of plague. I tend to think it has more to do with the Shabbat. But as the distinction is being made in terms of who's being set up, well, you would have people who are keeping Shabbat, they're not going to have an issue with buying and selling on Shabbat anyway. What will set you apart? Well, remember, those four horses are keyed to the colors of leprosy. And so as they go out, you can see that what may actually set these people apart might be more than just a mark, a nega. The mark or the distinguishing may actually come through famine, plague, sword, and wild beast. Right? Because they worship the beast. They worship that economic system. They think that's their source. Or in another case, they might worship that particular sword. They might worship that particular military system and think, well, my military is invincible. Well, probably not. Not until you meet the armies of God, and then it's not invincible. You might think you're famine proof, but you're not. And so when you see something as prevailing as this virus, how it can affect the entire world, then you can also see how one coming right on the end of the other. You don't need one to go in any particular order in order for the rest of them to become active. Will there be famine? In other words, will there be hunger? Yes, because people have lost their jobs. Will there be unrest? Will there be mental instability? Will there be rebellion? Yes, there will be sword. Will people start acting like wild beasts because of the economic system? Yes, there will. Could there be a new outbreak? Yes, there could. All those things can continue to work together because that's what they do. And Ezekiel's prophecy gives us the reason why. He says it's because you've spread the blood on a smooth rock. And the way that that's understood in rabbinic interpretation, it means, our instructions, I'll go ahead and stop sharing this. Our instructions concerning blood is to pour out the blood on the ground. If you're going to eat an animal, cover it with earth. Show it the respect. The life is in the blood, the nefesh, the soul is in the blood. There is a particular procedure. We're not supposed to be drinking blood. We're not supposed to be leaving blood out for people to see. And they say that what that blood on the smooth rock is they say we are shedding blood without shame. In other words, there has been a shedding of blood in the land, or in this case, in the world. It's not isolated to one country. There has been bloodshed in the world. And these nations have left the blood on a smooth rock. In other words, the blood that they're letting, and I know my first instinct was abortion. But that's not the only blood that's being shed. We have a generation now that thinks nothing of loading up pockets full of 30-round magazines, going into a movie theater and mowing down as many people as they can before they run out of ammo. And there's no shame in it. We've lost shame for letting blood. When we lose our shame for letting blood, when we leave it on the smooth rock, and we no longer consider it morally wrong, then we've actually returned to that era of Noah. Remember, there were basic instructions given to Noah. You don't eat the limb of a living animal. You don't eat that blood. You don't murder people. Even in your simplest form as a human being, there is a sense of morality that you should be born with. You shouldn't be stealing from one another. You shouldn't be shedding blood without shame. And people have no shame. They're fine with even killing scores of people than killing themselves. There's no shame in that anymore. It used to be such a huge shame, somebody in the family killed themselves. There's no shame in it. What does that tell you? Great deception has gone into the world, and it's trying to harvest not just us, it's harvesting our children. And they say in Ezekiel, the implication the rabbis are reading out of this blood on the smooth rock is it's a generation that has reached a point where they have no shame for the shedding of blood. It's just a big deal. So what? It's not really morally wrong. It's a choice. It's the way I choose to live my life. And where we've lost the shame, it's going to incur the greater judgment. Because remember, he does deal with blood. What was the first plague on the Egyptians? Blood. And we can reach, the highest level of the cup where he says this far and no more. This is it. This is all I can tolerate. And I think we've reached a point in our generation where this is all he's going to tolerate without heavy punishments rolling out one on the heels of the other.